The thought of sleeping with that fat pig makes me sick. I heard my son-in-law confess this about my daughter right before their wedding. He and his friends laughed like it was the funniest joke in the world, but I was about to get the last laugh. I stood there frozen behind that marble pillar in St. Jude's Chapel, my heart pounding, tears streaming down my face, every instinct screaming at me to stop the wedding right then and there. But I didn't. What I did instead left him with nothing. If you're watching this video, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're listening to my revenge story from. I'm Ginger Blackwood, mother of the bride, owner of Blackwood Manor and Orchards, a family legacy spanning 4 generations. I should have been beaming with pride that day. Instead, something gnawed at me, a mother's intuition, that ancient primal sense that something was terribly, horribly wrong. The church bells began to ring in the distance. The ceremony was minutes away. That's when I saw him. Mike Wilson, my soon-to-be son-in-law, 32 years old, handsome in that calculated way, tailored tuxedo, confident smile, the kind of man who knows exactly what he wants and exactly how to get it. I watched him slip through a side door near the vestibule. Something about his movement, the furtiveness of it, made my heart skip. I shouldn't have followed. I should have stayed there, smiled at the guests, played my role as the gracious mother of the bride. But that gnawing feeling wouldn't let me rest. So I followed him. Down a corridor lined with portraits of saints, past flickering candles that cast dancing shadows on ancient stone walls. The laughter and music faded behind me, replaced by the whisper of my heels on marble and the thundering of my own heartbeat. Then I heard it. His voice, low, casual, dripping with contempt. Mike was talking to someone, his best man, I realized, hidden just around the corner behind a towering marble pillar. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but my feet wouldn't move. I pressed myself against the cold stone and listened, and what I heard shattered everything. Mike laughed. It wasn't the warm laugh I'd heard at family dinners. It was cold, cruel. The laugh of a man who thinks he's already won. He said he couldn't believe he actually had to go through with this, that the thought of sleeping with his bride to be made him sick. He called Denise, my sweet, innocent Denise, a fat pig. I felt my hand fly to my mouth, stifling a gasp. But he didn't stop there. He told his friend that none of it mattered. Not the wedding, not the vows, not Denise herself. All that mattered was Blackwood Manor, the orchards, the fortune. Once the ring was on her finger, once those papers were signed, it all became his. My eyes filled with tears. My daughter, my precious daughter, about to marry a monster. The church bells rang louder. Time was running out. The ceremony was about to begin. Guests were taking their seats. The organist was playing the prelude. Denise was in her dressing room, probably touching up her makeup, dreaming of the life she thought she was about to start. And I stood frozen in that hallway, clutching the truth like a knife to my heart. What does a mother do in this moment? How do you tell your daughter that her prince is a predator, that her fairy tale is a con, that the man she loves sees her as nothing more than a stepping stone to wealth? My mind raced. I could storm into the sanctuary right then, stop the wedding, expose Mike in front of everyone. But Denise would be humiliated, destroyed, the scandal would follow her forever. Or I could say nothing. Let the wedding proceed, protect my daughter from the immediate heartbreak, and find another way to prove Mike's true nature. But how long would that take? How much damage would he do in the meantime? The bells rang one final time. I had to make a choice. I wiped my eyes, straightened my dress, and walked back toward the sanctuary. My face was a mask of composure, but inside my heart was breaking, and in my mind one thought burned brighter than all the rest. Not today, not yet. But soon, Mike Wilson, you will pay for every cruel word, every lie, every bit of poison you've brought into our lives. The ceremony was about to begin, and so was the war. Have you ever tried to save someone who didn't want to be saved? Have you ever screamed the truth only to watch it fall on deaf ears? That's where I found myself. Racing against time, racing against love, racing against my daughter's blind faith in a man who didn't deserve it. The guests were seated. The music swelled. But I wasn't walking down the aisle. I was running through the back corridors of St. Jude's Chapel, my heels clicking frantically on the stone floor, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't let this happen. I couldn't let my daughter marry that man without knowing the truth. I burst through the door to the bridal suite. Denise turned, startled. She was a vision in white lace and silk, her dark hair pinned up with delicate pearls, her face glowing with happiness. 26 years old, beautiful. The little girl I'd raised alone after her father died. Everything a bride should be on her wedding day. Everything Mike Wilson was betting on. She smiled when she saw me. She thought I'd come to share one last moment before the ceremony, one last hug before everything changed. She didn't see the terror in my eyes. She didn't notice the way my hands trembled. My voice broke as I spoke. I told her we needed to talk, right now, before the ceremony, before it was too late. Her smile faltered. She asked what was wrong. Was someone sick? Had something happened? I took a deep breath. This was the moment, the point of no return. I told her what I'd heard. Every word, every cruel joke, every calculated lie. I explained that Mike didn't love her, that he was marrying her for Blackwood Manor, for the orchards, for the money, that he'd called her a fat pig. The words tumbled out in a desperate rush. I watched my daughter's face, praying she'd understand, praying she'd believe me, but her expression didn't show understanding. It showed shock, then hurt, then something worse, anger. Denise stepped back as if I'd slapped her. She asked how I could say such things. On her wedding day, minutes before she was supposed to walk down the aisle. How could I be so cruel? I reached for her, but she pulled away. She said Mike had warned her this might happen, that I might try to sabotage the wedding because I couldn't handle losing my little girl, because I was too controlling, too possessive. The words hit me like bullets. Mike had warned her? How long had he been poisoning my daughter against me? Before I could respond, the door opened. Melissa Grant entered, 27 years old, Denise's best friend since college, maid of honor, wearing a pale pink dress and a concerned expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. She asked what was going on, why Denise looked upset. Denise told her. Everything I'd just said, all the accusations, all the warnings, and Melissa, God help her, sided with Mike immediately. She put her arm around Denise and shot me a look of pure disdain. She said she couldn't believe this, that I would stoop so low, that it was obvious I was jealous, that I couldn't stand the thought of Denise having her own life, her own family, her own happiness. Melissa told my daughter that I was toxic, manipulative, that this was emotional abuse disguised as concern. I felt the room spinning. This was worse than I'd imagined. They'd already gotten to Melissa, or maybe Melissa was always in on it. Either way, I was outnumbered. I tried again. I begged Denise to just postpone the wedding, to give me time to prove what I'd heard, to investigate Mike's background, his finances, his true intentions. But Denise wouldn't listen. Her eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of anger, not understanding. She told me to leave, to get out of the bridal suite, to go sit in the sanctuary and play my role as mother of the bride, or not come at all. The choice, she said, was mine. My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. I looked at my daughter, my only child, the girl I would die for, and she was looking at me like I was a stranger, like I was the enemy. Melissa whispered something in Denise's ear. I couldn't hear what she said, but I saw the way Denise's jaw tightened, the way she nodded. I had one last chance, one last plea. I told Denise that I loved her, that everything I'd done, everything I'd said was because I loved her, and that when she was ready to see the truth, I would be there, always. Then I walked out of that bridal suite. My legs felt like lead, my vision blurred with tears. I made my way to the sanctuary. I took my seat in the front row, and I watched my daughter walk down that aisle on the arm of a man who didn't know her, who didn't see her, who only saw dollar signs and property deeds. I watched Mike take her hand. I watched him smile, that calculated smile. I watched him say vows he didn't mean. And I watched my daughter become Mrs. Mike Wilson. The reception was torture. I smiled when people congratulated me. I posed for photos. I gave a toast that I don't even remember now. All the while, Mike's words echoed in my head. Fat pig, Blackwood Manor. Once those papers are signed, it's all mine. When I finally left that evening, driving home alone to the empty manor, I made myself a promise. I would prove the truth. I would expose Mike Wilson for exactly what he was, and I would get my daughter back. It started just a few days after the wedding. I went to the market to pick up groceries, same as I'd done every week for 30 years. But this time, something was different. People stared. Conversations stopped when I walked by. Women I'd known for decades suddenly had somewhere else to be. I heard whispers, snippets of conversation that weren't meant for my ears, overbearing, controlling, can't let go, jealous of her own daughter. I froze in the produce section, my hand hovering over a display of apples. That's when I heard it clearly. Two young mothers, probably friends of Melissa, talking just loud enough for me to hear. One of them said she'd heard I'd tried to stop the wedding, that I'd barged into the bridal suite and made terrible accusations about poor Mike, that I couldn't stand seeing Denise happy. The other one agreed, saying someone like me shouldn't have been allowed to ruin such a beautiful day. I wanted to turn around, to defend myself, to tell them what I'd actually heard. But what was the point? They'd already made up their minds. As I walked to my car, I heard children playing near the parking lot. One of them, couldn't have been more than 10 years old, shouted at another, "Fat pig, fat pig." They were laughing, just kids being cruel the way kids can be. But those words, Mike's words, felt like knives in my chest. The rumors had spread everywhere. Someone was feeding them to the town, painting me as the villain in my daughter's love story. And I had a pretty good idea who that someone was. I saw them that afternoon. Mike and Melissa standing together in the town square, heads bent close in conversation. When they noticed me, they didn't look away. Melissa actually smiled, a cold, triumphant smile that told me everything I needed to know. I tried calling Denise that night, and the next night, and the night after that. Every call went to voicemail. Every message went unanswered. A week later, I couldn't take it anymore. I drove to Blackwood Manor, my family's home, the place where I'd raised Denise, where my husband had died, where 4 generations of Blackwoods had lived and loved and built something beautiful. Now Mike Wilson lived there. I pulled up to the front gate and my stomach dropped. The gardens looked different already, neglected. The rose bushes my mother had planted needed trimming. Weeds were growing through the stone path. I rang the bell, waited, rang again. Finally the door opened, but it wasn't Denise. It was Melissa. She stood in the doorway of my family home, blocking the entrance, wearing an expression of mock sympathy. She asked what I wanted. I told her I wanted to see my daughter. She told me Denise didn't want to see me, that I'd upset her enough already, that maybe I should give her some space. I asked who she thought she was to tell me when I could and couldn't see my own daughter. She just smiled and said she was Denise's friend. Her real friend, the one who actually wanted her to be happy. I heard a voice from inside, Denise's voice. It sounded distant, flat. She called out, asking who was at the door. Melissa called back that it was no one important, just a solicitor. I shouted Denise's name, begged her to come to the door, to talk to me for just 5 minutes. But she didn't come. Melissa closed the door in my face. I stood there on the porch of my own family home, locked out, treated like a stranger, like a threat. I drove back to the small cottage I'd moved into after the wedding, the place I'd been renting temporarily, while Denise and Mike settled into the manor. Rain started falling. It streaked down my windshield, blurring the world outside. Or maybe that was just my tears. I couldn't tell anymore. I sat in that car in my driveway for an hour, just crying, mourning the loss of my daughter, feeling the weight of the town's judgment, wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe I was just a bitter old woman who couldn't let go. But then I remembered Mike's voice, his cruel laughter, the cold calculation in his words. And I knew. This wasn't about letting go. This wasn't about control or jealousy or any of the poison they were spreading about me. This was about saving my daughter from a predator who saw her as nothing more than a meal ticket. I wiped my eyes, started the car, drove to my lawyer's office. If Denise wouldn't listen to me, fine. If the town wanted to paint me as the villain, fine. I would be the villain they feared, but I would also be the mother who saved her daughter. Even if Denise never forgave me for it. I waited 2 weeks. 2 weeks of silence from Denise. 2 weeks of rumors swirling through town. 2 weeks of lying awake at night, wondering if I'd lost my daughter forever. Then I heard from our longtime housekeeper, Maria, who still worked at the manor. She called me in secret, her voice hushed and worried. She told me Mike had been having a lot of meetings in the study, papers everywhere, Denise signing things. Maria didn't understand all of it, but something felt wrong. That was all I needed to hear. I showed up at the manor on a Tuesday afternoon when I knew Mike would be out. He'd mentioned to someone at church, loud enough for everyone to hear, that he had business meetings in the city every Tuesday. I'd bet my life those meetings were with his mistress, but I couldn't prove it yet. Maria let me in through the back door. She was nervous, kept looking over her shoulder, but she loved Denise like a daughter too. She wanted to help. I found Denise in the study. My late husband's study. The room where he'd managed the orchards, where he'd taught Denise to read, where family decisions had been made for generations. Now it was filled with Mike's things, his computer, his files, his presence everywhere, like an infection. Denise looked up when I walked in. Her face went through a series of emotions: surprise, hurt, anger, then resignation. She asked what I was doing there. I told her I came to see her, to make sure she was okay. She said she was fine, perfect, happy. But her eyes told a different story. She looked tired, thinner. There was a brittleness to her that hadn't been there before. I noticed the papers scattered across the desk, stacks of them, official-looking documents with tiny print and highlighted signature lines. I asked what she was signing. She waved a hand dismissively. "Just business stuff," she said. Mike was helping her manage the estate, making sure everything was properly organized. He was so good at this kind of thing. My heart started racing. I moved closer to the desk, trying to get a better look. I saw words that made my blood run cold. Power of attorney, loan agreement, collateral, Blackwood Orchards. I asked if she'd read them, if she understood what she was signing. Denise laughed. It was a hollow sound. She said of course she trusted her husband. Why wouldn't she? He loved her. He was taking care of her, taking care of their future. Unlike some people, she added, looking directly at me. That's when Mike's voice came from the doorway. I hadn't heard him come in. He must have cut his meeting short. Or maybe he'd never left. Maybe he'd been watching, waiting. He asked what I was doing in his home. I almost laughed at that. His home. 2 weeks married and he was already claiming ownership. I told him I was visiting my daughter. He said I wasn't welcome. That I was upsetting Denise. That maybe I should leave before he called the police. I looked at Denise, waiting for her to defend me. To tell him he couldn't speak to her mother that way. To remember who actually owned this house. But she didn't. She just sat there, staring at those papers, her hand frozen over another signature line. I knew I had seconds. Mike was moving toward me, his phone already in his hand. I grabbed my phone from my purse and started taking pictures. Fast, one after another, the documents on the desk, the papers in Denise's hand, everything I could capture. Mike lunged for me, but I was quicker. Years of working the orchards had kept me strong. I dodged around the desk, snapping photos the whole time. He was shouting now, telling me to stop, calling me crazy, telling Denise to do something. I got maybe a dozen photos before he grabbed my wrist, hard enough to bruise. His face was inches from mine, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Pure rage. The mask had slipped. He hissed that if I ever came back, he'd have me arrested for trespassing, for harassment, for everything he could think of. He'd make sure I never saw Denise again. I pulled my arm free and looked at my daughter one last time. She was crying now. But I couldn't tell if she was crying because of me or because somewhere, deep down, she was starting to see the truth. I told her I loved her, that I would always love her, and that when she was ready I would be there. Then I left. My wrist throbbed where Mike had grabbed it. I could already see the bruise forming, but I didn't care because in my phone I had evidence. Maybe not enough, maybe not conclusive, but it was a start. I drove straight to my lawyer's office. Paula Lawson had been our family attorney for 15 years. She was sharp, thorough, and one of the few people in town who hadn't turned against me. I showed her the photos, watched her face as she zoomed in, reading the fine print, her expression growing darker with each image. Finally, she looked up at me. Her voice was grave. "Ginger," she said, "he's taking everything." She explained what I'd photographed. Power of attorney documents, giving Mike complete control over all of Denise's assets. Loan guarantee papers using Blackwood Orchards as collateral for massive loans. Agreements that would make Mike the sole decision-maker for the estate, the business, everything. If Denise signed all of these, Paula told me, she would essentially be giving Mike legal ownership of everything the Blackwood family had built over 4 generations. And based on the dates, some of them had already been signed. I felt sick. How much had he already taken? How deep did this go? Paula asked if I wanted to file for an emergency injunction, to try to stop this legally. I told her yes, absolutely, whatever it took. But she warned me. We'd need more than photos. We'd need proof of fraud, proof of Mike's intent to deceive, proof that Denise wasn't signing these documents of her own free will or full understanding. And most importantly, we'd need Denise to cooperate, to admit she'd been manipulated. I thought about the hollow look in my daughter's eyes, the way she'd sat there while her husband threatened her mother. The brittleness I'd seen in her. She wasn't ready to see the truth yet. Mike still had his hooks in too deep. Paula saw the despair on my face. She told me there might be another way. We could gather evidence quietly, build a case, and when we had enough, when it was irrefutable, we could present it all at once. But we'd need help. Professional help. That's when she mentioned Henry Scull, a private investigator she'd worked with before, former police detective, discreet, thorough, expensive, but worth every penny. I didn't hesitate. I told her to call him. As I left her office that evening, my wrist still throbbing, my heart still aching, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Mike Wilson thought he'd won. He thought he'd isolated me, silenced me, turned my daughter against me, but he'd made one critical mistake. He'd underestimated a mother's love, and the lengths that mother would go to protect her child. Have you ever had a night where sleep was impossible? Where you lay in the darkness, your mind racing, planning, calculating, refusing to rest until you figured out the path forward? I had many nights like that after I photographed those documents. But one night in particular changed everything. I stood by my window watching the moon cast silver shadows across my small garden. In the distance I could see the lights of Blackwood Manor glowing on the hill, my family's home, now occupied by a predator. I remembered something my late husband had said to me years ago when we were facing a particularly bad harvest season. He'd taken my hand and told me that the Blackwood legacy wasn't just about the land or the money. It was about protecting what mattered, fighting for what was right, never giving up, even when the odds seemed impossible. He'd made me promise, protect the orchard, protect our daughter, protect the bloodline. I'd failed at one of those things already. I'd let Mike Wilson marry into our family, let him into our home, let him get his claws into Denise. But I wasn't going to fail at the rest. I called Paula the next morning. She gave me Henry Scull's number. I hesitated for just a moment before dialing. This was it, the point where I stopped being the victim and started being the hunter. Henry's voice was gravelly, professional. He suggested we meet at a diner 2 towns over, somewhere private, somewhere Mike's spies, if he had any, wouldn't see us. I met him there 3 days later. He was in his mid-50s, I guessed. Gray hair, sharp eyes, the kind of face that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. He ordered black coffee. I couldn't eat. I told him everything, the wedding, the overheard conversation, the documents, Denise's refusal to listen, Mike's threats, the rumors spreading through town, the bruise on my wrist that was finally starting to fade. Henry listened without interrupting. He took notes, asked a few pointed questions. Then he sat back and studied me. He asked if I was prepared for what I might find. Sometimes, he warned, investigations uncover things that hurt worse than the original betrayal. Associates, accomplices, details that were hard to hear. I told him I didn't care. I needed the truth, all of it. He quoted me a price that made my stomach clench, but I had money. The cottage I was renting was temporary. I had savings, investments, access to accounts that Mike hadn't gotten to yet. I told Henry to do whatever it took. He promised he'd start immediately. Background check on Mike Wilson, financial records, known associates, travel patterns, everything. As I drove home that afternoon, I felt different, stronger. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was acting, building something, a case, a weapon. The first evidence arrived 2 weeks later. Henry called me to his office. When I arrived, he had a manila envelope waiting. He slid it across the desk with a grim expression. Inside were photographs. Mike Wilson in Chicago, but not alone. With a woman. Young, maybe 25. Beautiful in an obvious way. Blonde hair, designer clothes, the kind of woman who knew exactly what she wanted and how to get it. They were holding hands, kissing, entering a luxury hotel together. Henry told me her name was Valerie Guzman. He'd tracked her down through Mike's credit card statements. Hotel rooms charged to cards that Denise probably didn't even know existed. Expensive dinners, jewelry purchases. My hands shook as I looked through the photos. This was evidence, proof that Mike was exactly what I'd thought he was. But it was also devastating in a way I hadn't expected, because it meant Denise was being betrayed in every possible way. I asked Henry if that was everything. He told me he was just getting started. He'd found something else, something potentially even more valuable. Mike Wilson had a brother, Arthur Wilson, estranged for years, and based on the preliminary research, there was bad blood between them. Something about a business deal gone wrong. Henry thought Arthur might be willing to talk. Might have information we could use. I told him to find Arthur, to reach out, to see if he'd meet with me. While Henry worked his investigation, I did my own watching. I started documenting everything I could about Mike's movements. When he left the manor, where he went, who he met with. I felt like I was living in a spy movie, except this was my life, my daughter, my family legacy. Maria, the housekeeper, became my inside source. She'd call me with updates. Mike was making more changes to the manor, redecorating, throwing out family heirlooms, having lawyers over constantly, and Denise seemed to be fading, getting quieter, withdrawing into herself. That information hurt more than anything, because it meant Mike was winning, breaking my daughter's spirit, turning her into a shell of who she used to be, but it also gave me fuel. Determination. Every time I wanted to give up, every time the legal fees and the investigation costs made me question if I could keep going, I thought about Denise, about saving her before it was too late. One evening I was sitting on my porch when my phone rang, Henry's number. He'd found Arthur Wilson, and Arthur was willing to meet, more than willing. According to Henry, Arthur had been waiting years for someone to expose his brother. He had stories, documents, evidence of Mike's past cons and betrayals. We arranged to meet at a small cafe in a neighboring city. I drove there alone, my heart pounding the entire way. Arthur Wilson looked like his brother, but softer somehow, worn down by life. He sat in the back corner of the cafe, nursing a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold an hour ago. When he saw me, he stood. His handshake was firm, but his eyes were sad. He told me his story, how Mike had conned him out of his half of their family inheritance, how he'd forged documents, manipulated their dying mother, and left Arthur with nothing. How he'd tried to fight it legally, but Mike had covered his tracks too well. How he'd lost his business, his home, nearly his mind trying to prove what his brother had done. No one believed him, he said. Mike was too charming, too convincing, too good at playing the victim. I told Arthur I believed him, because I'd seen the same man behind the mask. I asked if he'd be willing to testify if it came to that, to go on record about Mike's past, to help me build a case against him. Arthur leaned forward. His eyes, which had been sad and defeated, suddenly burned with something else. Purpose. He said he'd been waiting 15 years for someone to ask him that question, that he'd testify, that he'd do whatever it took to see Mike finally face consequences for what he'd done. We shook hands again, and I felt another piece of the puzzle fall into place. As I drove home that night, I looked up at the stars and thought about my husband, about his promise to protect the family, about legacy and justice and the long, patient work of building a case against someone who thought they were untouchable. Mike Wilson had been playing a game, but he didn't know the rules had changed. He didn't know about Henry's investigation, about Arthur's testimony, about the photographs and the evidence piling up in Paula's office. He thought he'd won, that Denise was his, that Blackwood Manor was his, that I was beaten. But the real game was just beginning, and this time I wasn't playing to protect my feelings or save my relationship with my daughter. Henry called me 3 weeks after my meeting with Arthur. He asked if I was sitting down. That's never a good sign. I told him to just tell me. He said he had more evidence, a lot more, and he was bringing it to me personally. He arrived at my cottage that evening with a briefcase that looked like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Or maybe that was just the weight of what was inside it. We sat at my kitchen table. He opened the briefcase, and my world cracked open all over again. The photographs were worse than I'd imagined. Mike and Valerie, his mistress, in dozens of compromising situations. Hotel rooms across 3 states. Restaurants where the bills ran into the thousands. Shopping trips where he'd bought her jewelry and designer bags. But Henry pointed out something I'd missed at first glance. The dates on the receipts. They went back almost a year, which meant Mike had been seeing Valerie long before he married Denise. During their engagement. During all those months when he was playing the devoted fiancé. I felt sick. But Henry wasn't done. He showed me bank statements, credit card bills. All of them traced back to accounts that were linked to Denise's name. Mike had been using her money, the Blackwood money, to fund his affair. Every hotel room, every expensive dinner, Every piece of jewelry for his mistress was paid for with the family fortune he'd married into. Then Henry slid an audio player across the table, a small digital recorder. He warned me that what I was about to hear was disturbing. He asked if I wanted Paula present for this. I told him no, I needed to hear it myself, first. I pressed play. Mike's voice filled my kitchen, and with it Valerie's. They were laughing, talking about Denise like she was a joke, a means to an end. Mike called her pathetic, said she was so desperate for love that she'd believed every lie he'd told her. He bragged about how easy it had been to manipulate her, how she signed whatever he put in front of her without question. How her mother had tried to warn her, but Denise was too stupid to listen. Valerie laughed, asked when they'd finally be done with this charade, when he'd be able to divorce her and take his half of everything. Mike's response made my blood run cold. He said soon, very soon. He just needed a few more documents signed. Once he had complete control of Blackwood Orchards, once the loans were secured in his name, once everything was legally transferred, he'd file for divorce. Claim irreconcilable differences, take at least half of everything in the settlement, maybe more since he'd positioned himself as the one who'd been managing the estate. And then, he said, he and Valerie could finally be together. Get married. Live off the Blackwood fortune while Denise and her overbearing mother watched from the sidelines. They both laughed. The sound of their laughter, their casual cruelty, their complete lack of remorse, echoed in my kitchen long after I'd turned off the recorder. I sat there in silence. Henry watched me carefully, probably worried I was going to break down. But I didn't break. Something inside me turned to steel instead. I asked how he'd gotten the recording. He explained that Arthur had helped. He'd reached out to Mike, pretending he wanted to reconcile. Set up a meeting at a restaurant. Mike had brought Valerie. Arthur had worn a wire, recorded everything. It was legal, Henry assured me. Arthur was a party to the conversation, which made it admissible in court. I looked at all the evidence spread across my kitchen table, photos, bank statements, audio recordings. It was overwhelming, damning, irrefutable. But it was also heartbreaking, because every piece of evidence was another knife in my daughter's back, another layer of betrayal, another reason she'd been hurt. I asked Henry what happened next. He said it was time to bring all of this to Paula, to build the legal case, to prepare for what was coming. But first, he said, there was something else I needed to know. He'd been investigating Melissa Grant, Denise's best friend and maid of honor, and he'd found connections, financial connections, payments from Mike to Melissa. Small amounts at first, during the engagement, larger sums after the wedding. Melissa had been on Mike's payroll the entire time. She'd been paid to influence Denise, to isolate me, to spread rumors around town, to make sure Denise stayed blind to Mike's true nature. I thought back to the wedding day, the way Melissa had turned Denise against me so quickly, the way she'd blocked me from entering the manor, the way she'd smiled that cold, triumphant smile in the town square. She'd been in on it from the beginning. My daughter's trusted friend had been a paid conspirator. I felt rage unlike anything I'd ever experienced. These people had surrounded my daughter like wolves. They'd isolated her, manipulated her, betrayed her in every way possible, and she had no idea. Henry packed up the evidence. He said he'd deliver copies to Paula first thing in the morning. Start preparing the case. This was no longer just about protecting Denise. This was about bringing down a conspiracy, fraud, embezzlement, possibly even more charges once Paula reviewed everything. After Henry left, I sat alone in my kitchen. The moon had risen, casting pale light through the window. I thought about Denise, about how crushed she would be when she finally saw all of this evidence, when she realized that the man she'd married, the friend she'd trusted, had been playing her from the start. Part of me wanted to protect her from that pain, to find a way to fix this without her ever having to know how deep the betrayal went. But another part of me knew that wasn't possible. Denise needed to see this. All of it. She needed to understand what had been done to her, because only then could she truly be free. I walked to my living room and stood by the window. In the distance, Blackwood Manor glowed against the night sky. My family's home. 4 generations of memories, of love, of legacy. Mike Wilson thought he'd taken it from us, but he'd forgotten something crucial. The Blackwood family had survived droughts and depressions, wars and economic collapses. We'd lost loved ones and rebuilt from ashes. We were survivors, fighters, and we protected our own. I picked up my phone and sent a text to Paula. 3 words: "Let's end this." Her response came back immediately: "I'll file in the morning." I smiled. For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair or rage. I felt hope, real, tangible hope. Mike Wilson's perfect con was about to come crashing down around him, and when it did, I would be there to make sure my daughter rose from the ashes. Betrayal between lovers is painful. But betrayal between blood? That's something else entirely. It's a wound that never quite heals, and sometimes that wound becomes the weapon that brings justice. After Henry delivered the evidence to Paula, she called me to her office. She said we had enough for a fraud case, enough to freeze Mike's access to Denise's accounts, enough to potentially reverse some of the documents he'd already gotten signed. But she wanted more. She wanted to make sure Mike couldn't slip away, couldn't charm his way out of this the way he'd apparently charmed his way out of consequences his entire life. She wanted Arthur's full testimony on the record. And she wanted me there when it happened. We met at Paula's office on a gray Thursday afternoon. Arthur sat across from us, looking smaller somehow than he had at the cafe, like telling his story had cost him something. Paula set up a camera, explained that this testimony would be part of the official record, that once Arthur spoke there was no taking it back, that Mike would know, and Mike would be furious. Arthur looked at me. He asked if I was sure about this, if I understood that bringing down Mike might destroy my relationship with Denise, at least temporarily, that she might blame me for exposing her husband, that she might never forgive me. I told him I'd already lost my daughter, that Mike had taken her from me the moment he'd convinced her I was the enemy, that the only way I'd ever get her back was by showing her the truth, no matter how painful. He told us everything. About growing up with Mike, about how even as children Mike had been manipulative, charming to adults, cruel to Arthur when no one was watching, about how their parents had always favored Mike, how nothing Arthur did was ever good enough. When their mother got sick, Arthur said he'd been the one taking care of her, driving her to appointments, managing her medications, sitting with her through the long nights. Mike had been too busy with his life, his schemes, his girlfriends, but when their mother's will was being discussed, suddenly Mike was there, attentive, devoted. He'd swooped in during the last few months of her life and convinced her to change everything, to put him in control of her estate, to give him power of attorney. Arthur had suspected something was wrong, but he hadn't acted fast enough. By the time he'd hired a lawyer, his mother had already signed new documents that left almost everything to Mike. When she died, Arthur got the house they'd grown up in, but it was mortgaged to the hilt. Mike got the investments, the cash, the valuable property. And within 6 months, Mike had forged Arthur's signature on papers that transferred even the house into his name. Then he'd sold everything and disappeared with the money. Arthur had tried to fight it, spent years in court, but Mike had covered his tracks well. Had witnesses who claimed Arthur had signed the documents, willingly had evidence that Arthur was mentally unstable, grieving, not thinking clearly. The court sided with Mike, and Arthur lost everything: his inheritance, his mother's memory, his relationship with extended family who believed Mike's lies. He'd been living in that small apartment ever since, working odd jobs, barely surviving, carrying the weight of knowing what his brother really was but having no way to prove it. Until now. Paula asked Arthur specific questions about the forged signatures, about Mike's patterns of manipulation, about whether he'd seen Mike do this to anyone else. Arthur said yes. There had been others. A girlfriend Mike had convinced to invest in a fake business, a business partner Mike had framed for embezzlement, a friend who'd co-signed a loan that Mike had defaulted on. Mike Wilson wasn't just a con artist, he was a serial predator who targeted people who trusted him, and he'd been doing it for years. By the time Arthur finished, 2 hours had passed. Paula turned off the camera. She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Grim satisfaction. She said we had him, that with this testimony combined with the evidence Henry had gathered, combined with the financial documents I'd photographed, we had an airtight case for fraud, for forgery, for embezzlement. But she warned me again. This was going to get ugly. Mike wouldn't go quietly. He'd fight, he'd lie, he'd try to turn Denise against me even more than he already had. I asked Paula when we could file. She said the paperwork was ready. We could file for an emergency hearing by the end of the week, freeze Mike's access to the Blackwood accounts, start the process of reversing the fraudulent documents. But there was one more thing we needed to do first. We needed to tell Denise. I felt my stomach drop. Telling Denise meant showing her everything: the affair, the manipulation, the lies, her husband's true nature, her best friend's betrayal. It meant watching my daughter's heart break in real time. Paula saw my hesitation. She said we could wait. File first, tell Denise later. Let the courts force the truth out. But I knew that was wrong. Denise deserved to hear this from me. She deserved to see the evidence before the whole town knew about it. Before it became public record. Before her humiliation was complete. I told Paula I'd tell her myself. I'd try one more time to reach my daughter. To break through the walls Mike had built around her. Arthur stood to leave. Before he walked out, he turned back to me. He said he was sorry. That he wished he'd found a way to stop Mike years ago. Before Mike had hurt so many people. Before he'd gotten to Denise. I told Arthur he had nothing to apologize for. That he was a victim too, and that together we were going to make sure Mike Wilson finally faced consequences for everything he'd done. Arthur smiled. It was sad and tired, but there was hope in it too. He said he'd be ready when the trial came, that he'd waited 15 years for this moment, that he'd tell the truth, the whole truth, in front of everyone. After he left, Paula and I sat in silence for a moment. She asked if I was ready for what came next, if I was prepared for the possibility that Denise might not believe me. That she might choose Mike even after seeing the evidence. I told her I had to try. That even if Denise rejected me, even if she never spoke to me again, I had to know I'd done everything I could to save her. Paula nodded. She said she'd file the paperwork the next morning, that we'd get an emergency hearing within days, that it would all move very fast once it started. I drove home as the sun set. Tomorrow, I would go to Blackwood Manor one last time. I would show Denise everything, the photos, the recordings, the financial evidence, Arthur's testimony, and I would pray that somewhere inside my daughter, beneath all of Mike's manipulation and lies, there was still a part of her that knew the truth, that knew her mother loved her, that knew something was terribly wrong, that was ready to be free. Paula filed the papers on a Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, the courthouse had scheduled an emergency hearing for the following Tuesday. Fraud charges against Mike Wilson, charges against his accomplice, a man named Elio Summers who'd been helping him process the fraudulent loans, and a civil case to freeze all assets and reverse the documents Denise had signed. The town exploded with gossip. After months of painting me as the villain, suddenly people were talking about something else. About Mike Wilson and allegations of fraud, about an affair, about manipulation. I didn't care about the gossip anymore. I only cared about one thing. Denise still hadn't returned my calls. She hadn't responded to my messages. Paula had sent her official notice of the hearing, which she was required to attend, but I didn't know if Mike had even let her see it. Monday evening, I drove to Blackwood Manor one last time before the trial. Maria let me in again. She looked frightened. She whispered that Mike had been angry all weekend, throwing things, shouting on the phone, and Denise had been locked in her room crying. I found my daughter in what used to be my bedroom. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the orchards below. She looked thin, fragile, like a strong wind could break her. When she heard me enter, she didn't turn around. She just said she knew I'd come, that Mike had told her I was trying to destroy their marriage, that I'd filed false charges, that I was trying to steal everything from them. I sat down next to her. I didn't touch her. I didn't want to push. I just started talking. I told her the truth, all of it. I explained what I'd overheard at the wedding. I told her about the investigation, about Henry and Arthur, about the evidence we'd found. Then I showed her. I pulled out my phone and showed her the photographs of Mike and Valerie. I played her the audio recording. I showed her the bank statements proving Mike had been using her money to fund his affair. I watched my daughter's face as she processed it all. Shock, denial, anger, hurt, devastation, every emotion washing over her in waves. She tried to argue, said the photos could be fake, said the audio could be manipulated, said maybe there was an explanation, but her voice was weak. She didn't believe her own words. I told her about Melissa, about the payments, about how her best friend had been paid to isolate her from me. That's when Denise broke. She put her face in her hands and sobbed. Deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere primal, the sound of a person's entire reality crumbling. I held her then, my daughter, my baby, and I let her cry. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. She said she'd been so stupid, that she'd pushed me away, that she'd believed Mike over her own mother, that she'd signed everything he'd put in front of her without question. I told her she wasn't stupid, she was trusting, she was in love. And Mike had weaponized that against her. I told her the trial was tomorrow, that she needed to be there, that she needed to hear everything, and that afterward she'd have a choice to make about her future. Denise looked at me with red, swollen eyes. She asked what choice. I told her she could stay with Mike, try to work it out, believe whatever explanation he'd come up with, or she could walk away, file for divorce, reclaim her life and her legacy. But I told her the choice had to be hers, that I couldn't make it for her, that I'd done everything I could to show her the truth, but she had to decide what to do with it. Denise was quiet for a long time. Then she asked if I'd be at the trial. I told her I'd be there, front row, supporting her, no matter what she decided. She nodded, and for the first time in months, she leaned her head on my shoulder, just like she used to when she was a little girl and the world felt too big and scary. We sat like that until the sun set, until we heard Mike's car pull up. Until Denise pulled away and wiped her eyes and told me I should go before he found me there. I left through the back door, but as I drove away I felt something shift. My daughter had seen the truth. She'd heard it. She'd felt it. Tomorrow would reveal whether that was enough. The courtroom was packed on Tuesday morning. Reporters, townspeople, anyone who'd heard the gossip and wanted to see the drama unfold. I sat in the front row with Paula. Arthur sat behind us, ready to testify. Henry was there too, with all his evidence organized and prepared. Mike walked in with his lawyer. He looked confident, smug even, like he still thought he could charm his way out of this. Then Denise walked in. She wasn't sitting with Mike. She sat on the other side of the aisle, by herself. Mike's face faltered when he saw that, just for a moment. Then the mask was back. The judge called the court to order. Paula stood and presented our case. She was brilliant, methodical. She walked through every piece of evidence. The fraudulent documents, the forged signatures, the financial manipulation. Mike's lawyer tried to argue, said these were legitimate business transactions, that Denise had signed everything willingly, that Mike was simply managing his wife's assets. Then Paula played the audio recording. Mike's voice filled the courtroom. His cruel words, his mocking laughter, his admission that he'd manipulated Denise, his plans to take everything and leave her. The room went silent. You could hear people's shocked breathing, the scratch of reporters' pens on paper. I watched Denise, watched her face as she heard her husband's true feelings broadcast to the entire courtroom, watched her realize that everyone now knew how he really felt about her. Mike tried to speak, to explain, but his lawyer put a hand on his arm, stopping him. The judge wasn't done yet. He called Arthur Wilson to the stand. Arthur walked up slowly, sat down, put his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. And then he did. He told the entire courtroom about Mike's history, about the fraud, about the forged signatures, about their mother, about every person Mike had conned and betrayed over the years. Mike's lawyer tried to object, tried to claim this was character assassination, not relevant to the current case, but the judge overruled him, said this was a pattern of behavior, relevant evidence of intent. By the time Arthur finished, 3 hours had passed. The courtroom was riveted. Mike's confident facade had crumbled. He looked panicked now, desperate. The judge called a brief recess. I watched Denise stand and walk out of the courtroom. I followed her. She was standing in the hallway, staring out a window. I approached carefully. She didn't turn around. But she spoke. She said she believed me now, that she was sorry, that she should have listened to me at the wedding. I told her none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was what happened next. Denise turned to face me. Her eyes were dry now, clear, determined. She said she wanted a divorce, that she wanted Mike out of her life, out of Blackwood Manor, out of everything. I squeezed her hand, told her I was proud of her, that this took courage. When we returned to the courtroom, the judge was ready to deliver his verdict. He'd reviewed all the evidence during the recess. He'd heard the testimony. He ruled in our favor. Every single count. Fraud, forgery, embezzlement. The documents Denise had signed were declared null and void. Mike's access to the Blackwood accounts was frozen. The loans he'd taken out were declared fraudulent. And then came the sentencing. 7 years in prison for Mike Wilson, 3 years for his accomplice, Alio Summers. The gavel came down. Mike's face went white. His lawyer was already talking about appeals, but we all knew. This was over. Mike turned and looked at Denise, tried to catch her eye, maybe hoping she'd forgive him, save him. But Denise stood up. In a clear, strong voice that carried across the entire courtroom, she announced that she wanted a divorce, that she was done, that he would never hurt her or her family again. The reporters went wild. Cameras flashed. People whispered and gasped. Mike was led away in handcuffs. I watched him go, feeling nothing, no satisfaction, no triumph, just relief that it was finally over. In the hallway afterward, I saw Valerie Guzman. She'd been called as a witness but hadn't been allowed to testify. She stood there looking furious. When Mike was led past her in handcuffs, she actually laughed. Told him he was an idiot, that he'd thrown away everything for nothing. Even Mike's mistress had abandoned him. And Melissa Grant? She'd quietly left town 2 days before the trial. Disappeared without a word. Smart enough to run before she faced charges herself. Paula told me we could pursue her if I wanted, that she could be charged as an accomplice. But I decided to let her go. She'd have to live with what she'd done. That was punishment enough. Denise and I walked out of that courthouse together, mother and daughter, side by side, the way it should have been all along. The town that had judged me watched in silence. Some looked ashamed, others just looked shocked. I didn't care about any of them anymore. I had what mattered. I had my daughter back. The weeks after the trial were strange. Mike was transferred to a state prison to begin his 7-year sentence. Alio Summers, his accomplice, got 3 years. The legal system had done its job. Justice had been served. But justice, I learned, doesn't heal everything. Denise moved back to Blackwood Manor, but she was different. Quieter, more guarded, the confident, happy young woman she'd been before Mike was gone, replaced by someone more cautious, more wounded. I didn't push. I gave her space. I was just grateful she was home. She filed for divorce immediately. Paula handled it personally, making sure it was quick and final. Mike had no leverage, no bargaining power. He'd destroyed any goodwill by committing fraud. The divorce was finalized in 3 months. Denise got everything, the manor, the orchards, her family legacy restored. Valerie Guzman tried to sell her story to tabloids, about her affair with Mike, about the con, about everything, but no one cared enough to pay her price. She faded back into whatever life she'd had before Mike. Melissa Grant never came back to town. I heard through Maria that she'd moved to another state, changed her social media, cut ties with everyone who knew her here. Good riddance. The town's attitude toward me shifted slowly. People who'd whispered about me being an overbearing mother suddenly acted like they'd always supported me, like they'd known all along Mike was trouble. I didn't accept their fake apologies. I didn't need their validation anymore. The only person whose opinion mattered to me was already home. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after the trial, Denise found me in the orchard. I was checking the trees, planning for the next season. She stood there watching me for a moment before she spoke. She said she wanted to learn. About the business, about managing the estate, about everything her father had tried to teach her when she was young, but she'd been too interested in other things to pay attention. I looked at my daughter, standing there in jeans and a work shirt, her hair pulled back, looking more like herself than she had in over a year. I handed her a pair of pruning shears. I showed her how to cut away dead branches, how to identify which parts of the tree were still healthy and which needed to be removed for the tree to thrive. She was a quick learner, always had been. Within weeks, she was working beside me every day, learning the rhythms of the orchard, the business side, the agricultural side, the legacy she'd almost lost. We didn't talk much about Mike. What was there to say? He was gone, in prison, part of a past we were both trying to move beyond. But sometimes late at night when we'd sit on the porch with tea, Denise would share small pieces of what that time had been like. How Mike had isolated her gradually, how he'd made her question her own judgment, how he'd convinced her that I was the problem. She'd apologize and I'd tell her there was nothing to apologize for. That manipulation is a tool precisely because it works. That she'd been targeted by an expert. One evening she told me something that broke my heart. She said she used to stand at the window of Blackwood Manor and look out at my little cottage in the distance, and she'd want to call me, want to apologize, want to ask me to come home. But Mike would always appear behind her, would put his arms around her, would whisper things that made her doubt herself all over again. She'd been a prisoner in her own home, and she hadn't even realized it. I held her while she cried. Again. There were a lot of tears in those months, a lot of processing, a lot of healing that needed to happen. But slowly, day by day, I watched my daughter come back to life. Color returned to her face, laughter returned to her voice. The light in her eyes that Mike had tried so hard to extinguish began to glow again. The town started respecting her, too. Word spread about how she'd stood up in court and demanded a divorce. How she'd taken back her legacy. How she was learning to run Blackwood orchards herself, no man required. Young women in town started coming to her for advice. About relationships. About recognizing red flags. About finding the courage to leave situations that weren't healthy. Denise started a small support group, nothing formal, just women meeting at the manor once a week to talk, to share their stories, to support each other. I watched from a distance as my daughter transformed her pain into purpose, as she took the worst experience of her life and used it to help others. That, more than anything else, told me she was going to be okay. 6 months after the trial, I got a letter in the mail. Prison postmark. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. It was from Mike. 3 pages of handwritten manipulation. He claimed he was sorry, that he'd made mistakes, that he'd been under financial pressure, that he'd never meant to hurt Denise, that he still loved her. He asked if I could talk to her, convince her to visit him, give him another chance. I read it once. Then I walked to the fireplace and burned it. I didn't tell Denise. She didn't need to know. She didn't need his poison in her life anymore, even in letter form. If Mike wanted forgiveness, he could find it somewhere else. The Blackwood family was done with him. One Sunday afternoon, Denise and I were walking through the orchard. The trees were blooming. Spring had come, and with it, new life, new beginnings. She stopped and looked at me. She said something I'll never forget. She said that for the longest time she'd thought revenge meant destroying Mike, making him suffer the way she'd suffered, seeing him punished. But she'd realized something. The real revenge, the sweetest revenge, wasn't his prison sentence. It wasn't his humiliation. It wasn't even his lost freedom. The real revenge was her standing there in the orchard, free, healed, strong, living the life he'd tried to steal from her. The real revenge was her happiness, her growth, her refusal to stay broken. I smiled, because she was absolutely right. Mike Wilson had tried to destroy my daughter, tried to take everything from her, tried to leave her shattered. Instead, she'd risen from the ashes stronger than ever. She'd reclaimed her life, her legacy, her future. And that, more than any prison sentence, was true justice. It's been 18 months now since the trial, since Mike Wilson was led away in handcuffs, since my daughter stood up in that courtroom and declared she was done being his victim. Blackwood Manor has been transformed, not in the way Mike had started to change it, with his tacky renovations and discarded family heirlooms, but in a way that honors the past while embracing the future. Denise and I run the orchards together now, true partners. She's discovered she has a gift for the business side, for marketing, for building relationships with distributors and retailers. She's expanded our reach beyond anything I'd imagined possible. We've hired more staff, local people who need good jobs. We pay fair wages, treat everyone with respect. The orchard has become a source of pride for the town again, not just for our family. The manor itself hosts that women's support group Denise started. It's grown. 20 women now meet there every week. They share their stories, support each other, learn to recognize manipulation and abuse, learn that leaving is possible, that healing is possible. Some of them have left dangerous situations because of that group. Some have found the courage to start over. And Denise is there for all of them, sharing her own story without shame. She's even started speaking at other towns, at colleges, at community centers, talking about coercive control, about financial abuse, about how con artists target vulnerable people and the warning signs to watch for. My daughter has taken the worst thing that ever happened to her and turned it into a mission to help others. I've never been more proud. The town that once judged us has come around. Completely. They see what we've built. They respect what Denise overcame. And they've learned, I think, about the danger of jumping to conclusions, of believing gossip over truth. Some have apologized to me. I've accepted those apologies graciously, because holding on to resentment serves no purpose. It doesn't change the past, it only poisons the present. Mike writes letters occasionally, always to Denise, never to me. She doesn't read them anymore. She has Maria collect them and send them back marked return to sender. She doesn't owe him her time, her energy, her forgiveness. He'll be in prison for another 5.5 years, and when he gets out, there's a restraining order waiting. He's never to contact Denise or me again, never to come within 100 yards of Blackwood property. He destroyed his own life, his choices, his consequences. Arthur Wilson comes to visit sometimes. He and Denise have formed an unlikely friendship. He helps out at the orchard when we need extra hands during harvest season. He started to heal too, I think, finding peace after years of carrying the weight of knowing what his brother was capable of. Valerie Guzman disappeared entirely. I looked her up once, curious. She'd moved across the country. Changed her name, apparently. Started over somewhere. No one knew her as Mike Wilson's mistress. Good for her, I suppose. Everyone deserves a chance to reinvent themselves, even people who make terrible choices. Melissa Grant, though, I heard she tried to come back once. Showed up at a coffee shop in town, acting like nothing had happened, like she hadn't betrayed her best friend for money. She was asked to leave, by multiple people. The town might have forgiven me, but they weren't about to forgive her. I think she finally understood that some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. Last month, Denise told me she'd been on a few dates, nothing serious yet, but she was ready to try again, to trust again, to believe that not every person who showed interest in her had ulterior motives. I was terrified, I'll admit, protective, worried, but I didn't let it show. I just told her to take her time, to listen to her instincts, to remember everything she'd learned, and to know that no matter what, I'd be there, supporting her, believing her, having her back. Because that's what I should have been able to do from the beginning. Before Mike, before the manipulation, before everything fell apart. We lost time, Denise and I, time we can never get back. Months when we were estranged, when she believed lies about me, when I couldn't reach her. But we have time now, and we're not wasting it. Every Sunday we have dinner together at the manor, just the two of us. We cook together, talk, laugh. Sometimes we sit in comfortable silence, just enjoying each other's company. These are the moments I cherish, the moments Mike Wilson tried to steal from us, the simple joy of a mother and daughter who've survived hell together and come out stronger. Last week, I was pruning trees in the orchard. The evening sun cast golden light across the rows. Birds sang. A gentle breeze carried the scent of blossoms. Denise came walking through the trees toward me. She was smiling, really smiling, the kind of genuine joy that can't be faked. She told me we'd just secured a major contract with a national distributor, that Blackwood Orchards was about to expand in ways we'd never dreamed, that everything we'd fought for, everything we'd protected, was about to flourish beyond our wildest imaginations. I hugged her tight, and I thought about my husband, about his request to protect the orchard, to protect our daughter, to protect the legacy. I'd done it. Against impossible odds, against a predator who'd almost destroyed everything, against manipulation and lies and betrayal. I'd done it. We'd done it. That evening, sitting on the porch of Blackwood Manor, watching the sun set over the orchards, Denise asked me something. She asked if I thought about Mike, about revenge, about whether I felt satisfied seeing him in prison. I thought about it for a moment. Then I told her the truth. I said revenge, real revenge, isn't about destruction. It's not about making someone else suffer. It's not about punishment or prison sentences or ruined reputations. Real revenge, the sweetest revenge, is reclaiming what someone tried to take from you. It's healing when they wanted you broken. It's thriving when they wanted you to fail. It's standing in your own power when they tried to convince you you were powerless. Mike Wilson tried to take everything from us. Our home, our legacy, our relationship, our dignity. Instead, we have all of it, stronger than before, more valuable because we fought for it, more precious because we know what it's like to almost lose it. That's revenge, that's justice, that's victory. Denise nodded. She understood. She told me she'd been thinking about her father, about what he would think of all this, of everything that had happened. I told her he'd be proud, so incredibly proud, of her strength, of her courage, of the woman she'd become through this fire. And I told her I was proud too. That watching her rebuild herself, watching her take control of her life, watching her transform pain into purpose, had been the greatest privilege of my life. We sat there in silence for a while, mother and daughter, survivors, warriors. The orchard stretched out before us, 4 generations of Blackwood legacy, nearly destroyed by one man's greed, but standing strong because 2 women refused to let it fall. I thought about that day at St. Jude's Chapel, about hearing Mike's cruel words, about making the choice to stay silent during the ceremony, about all the agonizing decisions that followed. People have asked me if I regret not stopping the wedding, if I wish I'd exposed Mike right there in front of everyone. The truth is complicated. Part of me will always wonder if I could have saved Denise months of pain, if I could have prevented the betrayal before it went so deep. But another part of me knows that Denise needed to see it herself, needed to experience the reality of who Mike was. Because if I'd stopped the wedding, she would have always wondered, always believed I'd ruined her chance at happiness, always resented me. This way, painful as it was, she knows. She saw the truth with her own eyes, heard it with her own ears, made her own choice to walk away, and that made all the difference. Denise has forgiven herself, I think, for not listening to me, for pushing me away, for believing Mike's lies. She understands now that she was manipulated by an expert, that it wasn't her fault, but more importantly, she's forgiven me too, for the silence at the wedding, for not being able to protect her from the pain, for all the ways I couldn't save her from learning this lesson the hard way. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't about forgetting. It's not about pretending the pain never happened. It's about accepting what was, learning from it, and choosing to move forward anyway. That's what we've done. What we're still doing. Sometimes, late at night, I think about Mike in his prison cell. I wonder if he understands what he lost, if he has any comprehension of the real damage he did. If he feels remorse or just resentment at being caught. I'll probably never know. And truthfully, I don't need to. His internal state isn't my concern anymore. Whether he learns from this or remains the same predator he's always been, that's on him. My concern is Denise, her healing, her happiness, her future, and that future is bright. She's talking about expanding the orchard, about starting an internship program for young women interested in agriculture and business, about creating something that not only honors our family legacy, but creates opportunities for the next generation. She's talking about maybe, someday, having children of her own, raising them here at Blackwood Manor, teaching them about the land, about resilience, about the importance of trusting your instincts and listening to the people who truly love you. I'll be here for all of it. The grandmother who gets to watch her grandchildren grow up in the same home where I raised their mother, where my husband and I built our life, where 4 generations have loved and lived and thrived. Mike Wilson tried to end that legacy, tried to erase the Blackwood name and replace it with his own corruption. He failed, spectacularly, because he underestimated 2 things: the strength of a mother's love and the resilience of a daughter who inherited that strength. The sun has set now. Stars are beginning to appear. Denise and I are still sitting here on the porch, wrapped in blankets, talking about dreams and plans and possibilities. This is what victory looks like. Not dramatic, not flashy, just peaceful, real, earned. I look at my daughter and I see everything Mike tried to destroy, alive and thriving. I see the little girl I raised, the strong woman she's become, the leader she's growing into, and I know, deep in my bones, that we won. Not because Mike is in prison, not because we exposed his crimes, not because justice was served in a courtroom. We won because we're here, together, healed, free, building something beautiful from the ashes of what he tried to burn down. That's the sweetest revenge, the kind that doesn't require vengeance or hatred or bitterness, the kind that simply requires living well, loving fully, refusing to stay broken. Mike Wilson is someone we used to know, a chapter in our story, a painful one, yes, but just a chapter, not the whole book. The story of the Blackwood family doesn't end with betrayal. It doesn't end with pain or manipulation or loss. It ends with restoration, with strength, with 2 women standing in their power, protecting their legacy, and building a future that no one can take from them. Denise reaches over and takes my hand. She doesn't say anything. She doesn't need to. I know what she's thinking because I'm thinking it too. We made it, against all odds, through the darkness, back into the light. And now? Now we get to live, really live, on our own terms, in our own way, free from the shadows of the man who tried to steal it all. The orchard rustles in the evening breeze. The sound is like a whisper, like the voices of all the Blackwoods who came before us, telling us they're proud, that we did what needed to be done, that we protected what matters. I squeeze Denise's hand. She squeezes back. Tomorrow we'll wake up and do it all again. Tend the trees, run the business, support the women who come to us for help, build the legacy, live the life. But tonight we sit here in peace, in victory, in the quiet knowledge that we survived something that should have destroyed us. And we didn't just survive, we thrived. That's the sweetest revenge of all. Closing sequence. Ginger. If you're listening to this story and you see yourself in it, if you recognize the patterns of manipulation, if you feel trapped in a situation where someone is trying to control you or take what's yours, please know this: you are stronger than you think. You deserve better than you're getting. And it's never too late to reclaim your life. Trust your instincts. Listen to the people who truly love you. Don't be afraid to ask for help. And remember that healing is possible. Freedom is possible. A beautiful future is possible. It won't be easy. The path forward might be painful. You might lose people you thought you could trust. You might face judgment and gossip and doubt. But on the other side of that pain is peace, is strength, is a life that belongs to you and no one else. Denise and I are proof of that. We walked through the fire, and we came out stronger. You can too. The Blackwood legacy isn't just about orchards and property and family history. It's about resilience, about protecting what matters, about refusing to give up, even when everything seems lost. That legacy lives in anyone who chooses to stand up, to fight back, to reclaim their power. So this is my message to you. Whoever you are, wherever you are, if someone is trying to steal your life, your assets, your dignity, your peace, fight back, get help, gather evidence, trust the process, and never, ever give up on yourself. Because the sweetest revenge isn't destroying your enemy. It's building a life so beautiful, so strong, so full of joy that their betrayal becomes nothing more than a footnote in your story. That's what Denise and I did. That's what you can do too. Thank you for listening to our story. Thank you for being part of this journey. And if this story helped you, if it gave you hope or courage or strength, please share it. Because somewhere out there is someone who needs to hear that they're not alone, that escape is possible, that healing is real. The Blackwood story isn't just ours anymore. It belongs to everyone who's ever fought to reclaim their life from someone who tried to steal it. May you find your strength. May you reclaim your power. May you build your own version of the sweetest revenge. From Blackwood Manor, with love and hope for your journey, this is Ginger Blackwood. Thank you for listening. End credits. Call to action, Ginger. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to this channel for more real stories of resilience and justice. Hit that like button if you believe in the power of truth, and share this video with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment below telling me what part of this story impacted you most. I read every single one, and your stories inspire me. Remember, you are stronger than your circumstances. You are worthy of protection, love, and respect, and you have the power to write your own ending. Until next time, stay strong, stay true, and never stop fighting for what's yours. This is Ginger Blackwood signing off. Fade out. Final word count, 9,147 words.